welcome back. Hope you've all had a break and some refreshments. It's been lively debate here in the Hilton. So the next element of this morning is our panel session. So we have our four panelists here, but before I introduce to them, I want to just refer to back to Slido and four questions that we've set up there. And one of these is going to come pretty quickly, so I just want to give you all a chance to answer that before we launch into the panel. So there are four Slido questions for this particular part of the briefing. The first is, what is the biggest challenge for your organization in implementation of the sustainability standards? Then, does your board or committee receive adequate training to perform their respective roles? Are positions on audit committees an attractive proposition? And is cybersecurity an active topic on your board or committee's agenda? So there's four questions for you to mull over. And as I said, if you could get weaving on the first one in particular, because we'll be back to it in about a minute, that would be great. So I'd like to introduce very briefly the panel we have here. Their bios are far too long for me to go through in detail, but we should get, as you can see, a very broad range of perspectives. So immediately beside me is Stephen Gork, who's CFO of Elavon. I was just saying, every time I tap, I see Elavon written on whatever I'm tapping on, but he assures me it's not a monopoly. Then next we have Doraka Janis, who's EY Head of Climate Change and Sustainability Services. Then Patrick Gorry, who's Audit Insurance Partner in Mazars. And then at the far end, Aidan O'Mahony, who's Head of ESG Advisory in Goodbody, and very busy on that front at the moment, even right up to yesterday and today. So hopefully he'll have some interesting perspectives to share. Okay, so I've given that about as much time as I can. So if we have the answers perhaps to the first Slido question, so just as a reminder, that was what is the biggest challenge for your organization in implementation of the sustainability standards? So hopefully we can get some answers up on that. Waiting to see any of them coming through. And I'm going to turn behind it. Resourcing. How can we deal with both financial and non-financial reporting? That is an absolutely huge issue, and good to see that people are seeing it's different. There are different aspects to that. It's not just one you lump on top of the other. Cost and resourcing again, knowledge, resources, and then understanding of all the items. Resourcing. I think is probably one that's focusing a lot of minds, and I suppose that reflects perhaps, and leading on from the previous discussion we had, people are maybe at that sort of gap analysis stage, and they're looking at, well, what do we need to do? And resources are probably front and center in terms of how we address this. So very useful, thanks for that. So maybe if we can crack on with the panel, and I suppose maybe Aidan, and it's great to have this, your perspective. We've never had it on the panel before in terms of that investor perspective. So maybe starting from you with, why does sustainability matter in that corporate context?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. For me, there's three real arguments as to why sustainability should matter in a corporate context. And the first two are two I generally don't speak about when I speak to corporates, but I'll mention them here anyway. And the first is the moral argument. We have an obligation to ensure there's a healthy planet for future generations, and the corporate world has a major role to play in ensuring that happens. The second is the regulatory argument. I'm sure most people here will be actually more familiar with some of these standards than I am, but SFDR, CSRD, etc. If you aren't taking sustainability seriously and you're in scope for these regulations, then you need to start making sustainability matter to your organization. The final one, and the one that I tend to focus on, is the financial argument. Now, there's one aspect to that is around branding and around avoiding climate activists coming and targeting your organization. You only have to look at multinationals. Every single one of them seems to have some sort of advertising campaign that speaks about their sustainability credentials, appealing to youth, etc. But the one I look at most is balance sheet. Sustainability can be made to work for your balance sheet, and how it does that is by giving you access to a wider and a deeper investor base. SFDR defines the investment fund universe in Europe into three categories: Article 6, 8, and 9. But Article 6, and I'm speaking broadly here, being no ESG, Article 8 being light ESG, and Article 9 being very dark ESG. The Article 8 and 9 funds now make up 57% of the total investment fund universe in Europe. So if sustainability isn't part of your organization, isn't part of your strategy to gain investment and funding, you're potentially cutting yourself off from a huge segment of the investor market. And it's not only Article 8 and Article 9 funds. Because SFDR focuses on disclosure rather than investment criteria, a lot of Article 6 funds actually explicitly take ESG into account when they're making investment decisions as well. So by having sustainability as part of your proposition, you're giving yourself access to a wider, deeper investor base, leads to more stable funding outcomes and hopefully better pricing as well.
Okay, and might come back to that actually. Maybe Doraka, turning to you. So companies are hopefully getting ready, some more than others perhaps, for sustainability reporting. Maybe if you want to talk a little bit, I suppose, around the nuts and bolts, I suppose, the processes and controls piece of that and how you're seeing that play out.
Good morning, everybody. Kevin, it's interesting. It's quite varied in reality because, I mean, for many people in this room, kind of assurance, sustainability is not new because there are voluntary reporters as well. So you've got to acknowledge that in the room. But the reality is, for many, they were 4 or 5 KPIs, so areas of interest that they wanted to report on, typically greenhouse gas emissions, maybe workforce-based KPIs. So they thought, many of those people think, oh, I'm in great stead. But actually, as they're getting ready now, they're saying, well, hang on a second here, because that was done by a sustainability team over in the left-hand field, in a nice little porter cabin in many cases. But genuinely a very small team, very focused on what I would call the E side of the equation. In reality now, we're looking at much broader agendas. Sven was very clear on that earlier on, as was Michael and Andrew. So I suppose it's a bigger equation. Finance functions are getting involved. Why are they getting involved? Because very much to the processes and organisation and structure. So you have a very, very complex suite of standards because there are 12 standards within the CSRD. Okay, if you think about that, so it's not just one little thing, it's actually 12 different standards before we get into the sector piece, which is coming at us at some point. So I think people are beginning to say, okay, we need to think about this. The way I think about it is, for those of you who are old enough in the room, do you remember 2005 and IFRS came in and we all scratched our head and went, oh my good God, what's this? It's like that, plus socks on top. Okay, so take the two of them together and that's what you're looking at, because you need to have the structure and the processes. You need to think about your controls. So when the clients that I work with, and actually across corporate Ireland, people are saying, okay, we need to think about this in a different way. We need to engage with sustainability, finance, controls. Internal audit has a key role to play for those of you who have a strong internal audit function to help think about how to address kind of the different lines of defence. So I think finance is very important because I think the sustainability team will have the expertise and knowledge with regard to the topics, and there are many topics. Some topics are new, the social side of the house, no reference to social taxonomy this morning, but it's coming. There's lots of different things there. So I think it's about thinking through who should be at the table. I think from an audit committee perspective, it's quite interesting because you're thinking, oh, okay, who should be at the table? Who at this table knows who should be at the table? So that's another thing to think about, and we'll probably touch on that again. But I think from a business perspective, I think it's really thinking about the roles and responsibilities. The question that I get asked most often is, who should own it? So who should own this agenda? Is it finance? Is it sustainability? Is it legal? Because guess what? Legal counsel has a lot of views on what's being disclosed. So I think it's actually a combination of all. Many clients are actually creating an ESG reporting team. And this is kind of a team that sits in the nexus of finance and sustainability with very heavy legal support. So there is a thing about looking at your own organisation, thinking about the size of the organisation, the competencies within your own organisation, because you may have people who really lean very well into that structured reporting who may not sit in finance, they may sit in another area. There's a lot of environmental scientists and engineers who are only dying to get their hands on this and sort it out and structure it in a way that makes sense as opposed to those finance people. But genuinely, it is about sitting back and just thinking about who's best positioned, what resources you have. I think there was a reference from Andrew earlier on saying invest early. I would completely agree with that. Slight challenge is the talent isn't there. You're not walking out the door and going to find 25 people waiting for all the audit committees to come out and say, oh, come, I'd like to employ you. It'd be great if they were outside the door, but they're not. And the next piece is actually the disparate systems that you currently use, because a lot of this information sits within your organisation. So from a process and controls perspective, if I was sitting on a board, I'd be saying, well, what systems am I using? What will I need to rely on? And I think at the moment, yes, there are aspects that you can use and rely on, but they don't all come together in the one suite. There's lots of options. I think Michael mentioned people are ringing him every day. Well, people will be ringing the people in your organisations every day as well. But then it's about what's fit for purpose for you. So if you think about the ERP system you have today, unfortunately, in corporate Ireland, many people struggle with the ERP system investment because they don't really see an immediate return. This is a great opportunity to say, actually, stand back. What are we investing in from a finance perspective and non-finance? And think about a reinvestment, a reinvigoration of kind of spending in IT and thinking about what makes sense for you. Because ultimately you want to automate this. You don't really want, although it's a reference to Excel earlier on, and there's a lot of people using Excel, don't want to tell you how many. That is a big challenge. So I think to think of it from an organization perspective, it's about identifying the right people, giving them the time, giving them the roles, thinking about how to invest in actually systems and technology in a way that's fit for purpose, fit for the size of your organization, and then just working through how to make sure that, you know, you do things one time and one time only. Because I think that's a challenge. And aligning information and data, and I'd love to talk about data forever, but I don't think I'm going to be allowed. But I think that's a really important factor as well. There's lots of new data and information that resides in your business, but is used for totally different purposes. So it's then how do you get access to that and structure it and get a kind of a data warehouse that you can then use? Because again, it's about that will actually give you competitive advantage when you know what you're at.
Yeah.
In lots of different ways, not just for reporting. So please don't see this as only a compliance exercise. It's really important to get it right before you shoot me. But actually, it's also really important to understand it and the power of the information that you will now have about your organisation that is end to end. So I think it's important to bring that mindset to the audit committee and to the board so that it's seen as an opportunity.
Yeah, and I mean, one point I've made repeatedly, and maybe to counter something that Andrew said before the break, I'm forever going on about strategy process reporting and not the other way around, because the other way around, you know, the whole thing will fall apart and you won't get buy-in, and like you say, even the buy-in to resource investment
Absolutely.
won't be happening either. Maybe Aidan, if I could go back to you just to tease out a bit that whole investment community impact. You talked there about 57% of funds now sort of focusing on this area. So if you're looking at a green investment program, you know, what are the incentives, but also I suppose what are the deterrents in setting up a green investment program?
Yeah, well, the incentives are that access to a wider, a more stable, a deeper investor base. You know, and in terms of pricing, which is the question I'm always asked in these corporate meetings, you know, what is the actual financial benefit? There is some debate on this point as to how much the pricing improves for a green versus a conventional issuance. I'm confident in saying 5 basis points is available at least, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but if you're issuing, you know, €1 billion of debt, or as we did yesterday with AIB, 750 million euros, that 5 basis points does add up. And it means that programs like this add, you know, they more than wash their own face. But more than that, it's the stability it brings to your funding. So just taking yesterday again as an example, when we did the AIB bond, you know, there's a difficult geopolitical backdrop in markets at the moment. There's an uncertain rate environment, which meant that markets were a bit choppy. Not an ideal day to be trying to place a bond of that size. But having the green element attached to the bond program instead of it just being conventional meant that when we're going out to the very, very large fund investors, and I'm thinking about, you know, people like PIMCO, Mundy, Schroders, BlackRock, they have a central fund that will order into almost anything as long as they consider it a good credit and something that'll make them return. But increasingly, they'll have side funds that are just focused on SRI investment, socially responsible investment. And on a day like yesterday, when people are perhaps striking a more cautious tone because they don't know how things are going to play out geopolitically, etc., the central fund might not give you an order, but the committed SRI funds that are around the central fund, they're asked to buy green investment because there just isn't enough of them for them. So when you come out and if you can establish a reputation as being a really good green issuer, and you know, you'll create that loyal following amongst the really big funds and amongst the committed smaller SRI funds. So it's the stability, the ability it gives you to issue into a choppy market as well as into a very bullish market. And in a bullish market, because there's all that extra demand as well, you drive better pricing tension, better outcomes. In terms of deterrence, the deterrents are really around cost and time. Now the costs are pretty modest to set up a green program. They're not. I wouldn't consider them in any way prohibitive in terms of a barrier to entry, but the time is significant. And I've heard resourcing being mentioned quite a bit already today. You know, when I first started setting up AIB's green bond program years ago, it was something I was doing in addition to my day job, and it quickly became obvious that this is not something that can be done part-time. It needs full-time attention. So, because it does require a lot of management time to set them up properly. So if you if you are going to embark on doing these programs, you need to ensure that you have it adequately resourced when you're looking to do it, and that's the deterrent, is you have to staff resourcing really, rather than the costs of, say, getting your SPOs and engaging with impact analysis people. It really is the time investment.
Okay, very good. So Stephen, if I could turn to you, and building on Durarka's terrifying comment that this is IFRS plus SOX combined, from an industry perspective, I suppose, what are the key differences and challenges that you see in implementing these new standards compared to some of those earlier challenges that came along?
Yeah, I think it's useful to benchmark against where we are in financial statements. If you think about financial statements, double entry's been around for hundreds of years. Financial accounting standards have been around for decades. IFRS was mentioned, that's been around since the mid-2000s. These standards are coming out, so the level of maturity, if we benchmark financial statements against these new standards, is very, very different as a proposition. Second thing then is it's a much broader sphere of stakeholders. In financial statements, we typically think about the financially connected stakeholders, that's customers, investors, our creditors, our employees, but now we're thinking about our entire community and potentially writing these disclosures with all of them in mind. I suppose the fact that, as Sven was talking about this morning, the standards, even the ones that have come out, we've had 12 come out, there's another 41 due, and even they're being delayed. I would also probably think we should be looking around the corners and thinking that the way this has been structured as a set of laws and regulations it's set up that these standards will then get revised over time. So we need to have an eye for that. That once we get through the first 12 ESRSs, the following 41 then sector specific, we're going to start seeing revisions then as the Commission learns about how the kinds of disclosures they've seen and how they want to fine tune it. And so this is really for the long term. Yeah, I'm going to be yet another person who's going to talk about data. We have well-established systems in our firms to look at financial data, process the debits and credits, bring that through to financial statements, create the notes that sit behind it, have a whole suite of controls that sits on top of that. These sets of data sit in disparate parts of the organization. In many cases, they're offline. They need to be brought online. We're all going to be thinking about some form of ERP to put them into, and then collate that over time. And that's before we start thinking about things like data lineage and having the controls over those data points, so that as we publish them to the market and to stakeholders, we can have confidence in them. So that's a very tough challenge in itself. And that brings me nicely on to assurance. Assurance is something that I think every audit committee is going to be talking about, and the transition from towards reasonable assurance. I think there's only a partial comfort in the fact that we're transitioning towards reasonable assurance, and the reason I say that is that we need to think about the kinds of disclosures that we're making now, and as the assurance standards go up, what might cause us to have to revise those disclosures in future years. And does that mean that some of the disclosures we made earlier on need to be fine-tuned or indeed even restated? So that the focus in our discussions on assurance levels is that should only be a partial comfort that we're transitioning to reasonable assurance. We need to think, do we have the right controls in right from the start? And that's only, as I say, a partial mitigant. And then lastly, one thing I'd point to, and we have a lot of discussion about this in our firm, is the balancing between the practicality of delivery and the enthusiasm that we have from our own colleagues and right the way up to board. So there is, I think, in most firms, if not all, a natural wellspring of enthusiasm for all of the aspects of ESG, and it's the one area in our firm where you're guaranteed to get a set of volunteers who want to get involved in things like climate change, who want to get involved with social commitments that we have, making sure that we're a well-run firm. And then the next natural step is to say we want to commit to hitting certain milestones. That's then when we need to, as boards, think about the practicality, because we don't want to find ourselves accidentally greenwashing because we've overstated our current position, or over-promising where we can get to in the timeframes in the coming years. So it's how do we harness that wellspring of enthusiasm that people have, while also setting ourselves practical and meaningful, hittable targets over the coming years.
Okay, that's a short list.
Yes.
Patrick Ory, maybe turning to you. I suppose, again, a similar question as I posed to Durarka in terms of what you're seeing as an auditor in terms of clients. I suppose maybe the different waves of clients, I suppose, as well. what you're seeing there in terms of preparation.
Yeah, exactly. And coming from an external audit perspective and working with clients who are on their implementation journey, but also speaking to our consultancy colleagues internationally and locally where they're advising on the implementation steps, very much the state of progression is driven by what wave a company needs to first comply with the standards. And understandably, we see companies in wave one much further progressed in that process and project. Many companies are at this point, at the materiality scoping phase, and some in fact have moved beyond it. We do see the reporting lines established, working group steering committees established, reporting into those charged with governance, be it audit committees or boards or directors. So it's very positive from that perspective. One, I suppose, maybe a concern is too strong a word, but one area where we definitely see companies having more struggles than with others, it's like, as Derek said, the ESG equation. Companies are more comfortable on the climate aspects of the changes, whereas societal and governance aspects are more new and de facto then going to be more challenging for implementation. When we look to companies that are in the later waves of implementation, many of those are within the tendering process at the moment, obviously reaching out to professional service providers for support. For those companies in those second and third waves who have a base level of awareness, if today hasn't scared everybody at this point, there certainly is moving from a high level base awareness to even a deep understanding of the practical impacts of putting in place a project team to start you on that journey is not to be underestimated. And I'd certainly say time is of the essence in that respect. One concern that we do hear from our clients is the context of the sector aspect to this, and Stephen briefly touched upon it, but it's from the perspective of companies and stakeholders wanting to know where they may sit in terms of what is baseline compliance for a sector look like, and concerns around in year one reporting for gaps in remediation, how that might be perceived by stakeholders, how might it perceived by the marketplace. One thing I'll say is, and I think in a very positive reflection, I think there's a real collegial aspect to this. It's obviously very significant change. People are reaching out to the industry bodies, their colleagues, their networks, and they are information sharing. I think obviously that is a very positive. I think there's an essence that we're all in this together, so to speak. So I think just echoing the comments from the other speakers, the challenges around resourcing, data, systems, governance, we're probably all seeing the same things at this point.
Okay. Just one more question on this topic, which I might pose to Aidan. Just a couple of other things I want to raise with the panel. Data. We're talking a lot about data. I mean, are you seeing anything in the market that's working to sort of pull all this together, or is a solution to this data quandary?
No is the short answer. There are a lot of companies springing up in this space there. I mean, they're springing up like mushrooms, and I think mushrooms is a great analogy for them because they're growing in the dark as well. I don't think we have regulatory certainty yet, which makes their job more difficult. However, given how many corporates are struggling with the data challenge posed by ESG in particular, I mean, we're sort of trying to put ESG reporting and data on a par with financial reporting and data, but we're looking to do it over a period of about 5 years instead of a period of about 6 decades. So that just creates enormous challenges, and everyone's aware of them. There's a lot of companies competing to be offered the solutions. I've looked at a lot of them. AI is becoming the latest thing now with them as well. I haven't seen one that would satisfy me anyway, that would cover everything. Now, I could be doing a disservice. There could be a great company out there that is doing it, because there are so many, it's impossible to know. However, given the enormous challenge that's in place for the corporate world when it comes to this, I'm confident that a solution will develop, a standard. It's sort of like search engines in the late 90s. There is going to be a winner here, and there's going to be a few companies that come out of this that with really comprehensive data solutions that will be applicable to all corporates. I just haven't seen it yet, but there's so much potential revenue for a company that can master this that someone is going to do it. Okay,
there's a challenge for Ireland Inc. there. I think an opportunity. Okay, I want to move on and cover a couple of other things as well as sustainability. So if we could maybe call up the next couple of Slido questions. So they were: does your board or committee receive adequate training to perform their respective roles? So 2/3, 1/3. No, there is a gap in training for some specific areas versus yes, we receive adequate training. I'm actually sort of comforted by the fact that 38% feel they do get adequate training. I think that's probably a good thing. And then obviously the genuine sort of, we could always do it a little bit more, reflecting the other side. But that's probably a bit stronger than I thought it would be. And then probably the challenging question, are positions on audit committees an attractive proposition? Yes, they are. Well, that's great for everybody in the room. There's only 39% with buyer's regret, so we'll take on from that. So I suppose maybe getting into this whole area of joining an audit committee, and I suppose Patrick, if I was to ask you about this, if you were to give advice to new board members, people joining audit committees, what would your key messages be?
Yeah, I think the context to that question is considering what's happened in the last 5 years. If we take that as a reasonable time frame, while the roles and responsibility of a new audit committee member may not have changed by definition, the expectations of what it takes to carry out that role effectively have significantly changed, driven by market expectations as much as anything else. And that's whether you're in a regulated company, a non-regulated company, and in any size of organisation impacted by those expectations. And with that, obviously, training plays a critical role underpinning those skill sets that effective audit committee members and board members need to have to effectively perform their duties. So what would I say to new audit committee members this morning? I think from a first principles perspective, it's to focus on the basics. And when I say the basics, it's your core responsibilities about understanding the roles and responsibilities of an audit committee, the financial reporting framework of the company, the accountancy policies of that company, the regulatory environment, the key risks and challenges faced by that company. And it's worth recalling the ODC guidance, and actually, which is, I think, it's plus 10 years old at this stage, but it's explicitly clear that training is required for new audit committee members, covering those particular topics I've just name checked. But it also refers to audit committee members that don't come from a finance background, and it very much places the responsibility for training on the organisation itself. When we look to best practice perspective, and looking at the 62%, 38%, and looking across the water to the FRC's guidance, it's very clear for audit committee guidance that formal induction training should be provided to new audit committee members to help them support their role. I suppose audit committee members, again, look into what a training plan should look like. There's obviously recurring themes that should be on the agenda. Again, it's really focusing on the changes in the regulatory environment, changes in accounting standards, even changing in auditing standards. Obviously, you've got a role to assess and critically assess the role of the auditor on an annual basis, and you need to be able to speak that language. And obviously, that environment is changing continuously, and there's an upskilling involved there. One area that I might mention that can get neglected is beyond the purity of technical skills, which I think the community is better served for access to programs and CPD, is looking to the softer skills. And quite clearly, to be an effective audit committee members, you have to lean into those soft skills that you develop through your own career professional development. But when you look at that and think about it from a collective perspective, there's soft skill training that I believe that should be on any list that in that group there, that the 38% who believe they're getting, I've got the wrong stat there, but we've got the adequate training within their organisation. But skills around professional skepticism, training on effective communication, teamwork, culture, bias, are all topics that people need to be thinking about in order to maximise what you deliver as an audit committee at the end of the year. From a hot topic perspective, I suppose not coincidentally, I will mention CSRD and cybersecurity, which we're going to touch upon at the end. Quite clearly, CSRD, my only comment on that is that from a training perspective, it will not be one training session is a silver bullet. That will be continuous learning and development right through from the whole way through the process until reporting and beyond. It is that significant. From a cybersecurity perspective, and not to give away what we're going to discuss in a couple of moments, but increasingly IT environments are becoming more and more complex. The risk of cyber threats are increasing, and obviously giving rise to concerns for audit committee members and board members alike. And the language and the technicalities of that is also increasing. So, audit committees and boards need to assess whether those skills are at that board to be able to interpret and translate what is being told to them by their assurance providers, and therefore, it is reassuring that when we speak to our colleagues about what training sessions board and audit committee members are looking for, cybersecurity is very, very high on the list, as is CSRD. A final comment for me is just not to be remiss not to mention the work that industry bodies and accountancy bodies are doing, serving the community so very well, and to give a plug to the IOD. I know there's a workshop next month for new audit committee members, and the feedback I've received from that has been very positive. So for anyone who's joining an audit committee, it might be worth checking that out.
Okay.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah,
to
sorry,
that?
Dora,
Just
go
one
ahead.
thing you didn't mention that I think is a real challenge is the non-financial reporting piece, because obviously audit committees are used to that, and most of the people who sit in an audit committee come with a background that's very prepared for that space. Well, invariably they do. Actually, the whole challenge of CSRD is you actually have to think about climate scenario analysis, and you have to think about double materiality, which are alien concepts, but ones that actually sit at the audit committee and the risk committee to talk about, well, what is our position? Like, I was presenting to a board not so long ago, and we were talking about, well, do we believe in the 1.5 scenario? Are we in 2.5 or 4 scenario? What are we going as an organisation to sign off on? That's a really big decision. So I think it is really important and not incumbent on everyone that sits in this room and on audit committees to say, well, how do I get myself up the curve and who am I relying on? Because I think that's the one that actually has come to bite you in due course, because people are going to be saying, hang on, you sat at the table, you signed that off. And that actually gave the direction of travel for our non-financial reporting. So just something to think about, and like, not to scare people, but to actually say, well, who's looking after this? Who's looking after me? Am I looking after myself? Because there's a kind of a triangulation there as an audit committee member as to what does your role look like, how far should you go, what should you know, because that does set and train the reporting that we'll all talk about for the next 10 years of our lives, no doubt, and then it'll become normal and we'll all be grand.
I don't think so. That really goes to the training challenge, doesn't it? In terms of, as you say, it's training yourself, but also access to that expertise. Because I don't want to frighten all the audit committee members. Audit committees cannot be complete experts on everything, but I think they need to know enough to be able to ask the questions. I suppose that's where you want to get to. And
the other piece is you'll have people from different jurisdictions. So like I had somebody from the UK on that particular board who challenged the board saying, well, this is what we're doing in the UK, why aren't you doing this? So you have that jurisdictional challenge with different knowledge and different focus.
Okay.
So again, and it's important to have that challenge as well.
Okay, very good. So I suppose, Stephen, I maybe turn to you with a sort of, why would you do it question? Why would people join a prospective board?
Obviously, it's very important. It's the keystone of corporate governance. I think the IOD, I would echo that plug. They do a really nice job in terms of the qualifications of directorship, and also just board prep and making sure that as you're choosing a potential position that you're kind of doing the right due diligence and making the right choices. Probably add to that, I think, there was a book years ago, Crucibles of Leadership, and it looked at management teams that had been really successful. And effectively, the kernel of the book was, battle-hardened management teams do well. They've been challenged over time. They've gone through tough times, either individually or as an organization. And then when the next challenge comes along, they're that bit better. I think that's a good question to ask. If there's an absence of that type of crucible experience in the management team, it's a good sort of stress test question to ask as part of your due diligence. Is this a management team that if something bad comes from around the corner, that they'll be able to handle it? So I definitely would plug the IOD and just throw that one in as an extra. Okay, very good. I'm going to move on to cyber. Now that it's been teed up. We had, a Slido question. Is cybersecurity an active topic on your board or committee's agenda? So if we could throw up the answer to that question. 57% yes, or is a recurring topic, and 43% it's discussed at least annually. 0% it is never discussed. I think we'll all heave a sigh of relief in relation to that. So maybe, Durark, if I can turn to you on the sort of the broad topic, and perhaps without going into huge amounts of technical detail. So what should boards and committees be looking at and considering if they're looking at that, and what's the story that cyber disclosures are telling shareholders?
Well, look, I suppose it is important that it's talking to the shareholder and saying, what are we doing? Like, cyber risk is not new, but it's evolving and changing. And I suppose what we're having to address through cyber risk has changed. So I think from a board perspective, it's about challenging and saying, how does that reflect what we've currently done? We're all very conscious of AI at the moment and that changing landscape. So for me, it's about having a really clear policy and kind of clear structure on what cyber risk looks like in your organisation vis-a-vis how you write your business. And then also there's a piece around, well, actually, when we're looking at that, what do we do to test it? Because I think then that's the one that we've all heard about and we've read in the papers, like something went wrong and the response to that. So it's just thinking a little bit around, actually, I have a policy, the organisation structure, we have our strategy. The strategy is clear, but the strategy might have been kind of written 3 years ago. And then guess what? AI's come in, or a new generation of technology that you rely on, or a new customer base or profile that you're having to meet their demands. So it's about, as a board, sitting back and saying, okay, we have our cyber policy, we have our governance structure, but how do we manage it effectively? How do we check it out? How do we challenge it before it gets challenged by something outside the organisation? So I think it is by keeping it quite simple, because like as an audit committee, your duty is to make sure that the people in the business and the executives are actually kind of discharging their duties and asking the right questions, to your point of maybe just making that a little bit more resilient. But it is a really good question, because, you know, the last thing you want to do is have an event occur that you've never thought about. So it's about making sure that the systems are being interrogated, that the risk profile of the organisation has been updated, and that you're keeping up pace with what should be done, and that your executives are informing you of what they've done outside that would potentially put new risks in place, and making sure then you say, right, well then if that risk is in place, if this happens, what is our second line of defence, and how does this work? So I think it's not terribly complex and it's not new. It's just about making sure that you address the new challenges and you reflect that in what you disclose. Because again, what you disclose is the only thing the investor is going to read.
Yeah. And I do want to leave some time for Q&A. So maybe, Stephen, if I can turn briefly to you, and you know, from that management or board perspective, is it? Which are you 68, 33 or 0 in terms of it coming up on your discussion?
It comes up a lot. You know, when we think about stress testing our businesses and refer to stress testing, where we imagine the things that will cause our firms to fail, cyber typically is at the top or near the top of that list. So it's absolutely, for that reason, something that we talk about very, very consistently. You know, I think a big job of the management team is translating what is a very, very technical area into something that you know, the board can comprehend. It certainly helps if a member of the board is an expert in technology, even more so if they're an expert in information security, but often that isn't the case. So we need to make sure that we're asking the right questions to make sure that it's translated into something that the board can get its arms around. And maybe two things I would say in particular that certainly I focus on is this is a global threat, and so the bad guys out there are no respecters of legal entity boundaries or national boundaries. They are just looking all around the world for where there are weaknesses. So a question the board needs to ask is, how are we accessing global capabilities to counter that? Either if you're part of a global organization and leveraging that global organization, or working with vendors and partners to access that global capability to counter that global threat. And the second thing I would say is the speed of evolution of the threat. You know, every year there's new types of threats emerging. So, you know, a good question to be asking the information security team is what has changed in the last year in the way that you've looked to counter the threats that are out there, because the team, the information security team, and indeed the wider organization needs to be continually adapting to the threats that are out there.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in particular in your business, I mean, it's got to be front and center. But you know, as you see more businesses looking at AI, looking at the opportunities that are out there for, and also the risks of not, you know, transiting into where new business is at. Just cyber just becomes a bigger and bigger issue all the time. You nearly have to address it at the same time as you're addressing your strategy in some aspects. Yeah,
It's a must-have.
Okay, we have some time for questions, and I do want to see if there's any Slido questions first before I throw it open to the floor, because we've been somewhat remiss in that. So,
we have a few questions on Slido, and the first one I'm going to ask was one that we didn't get to earlier on, so delighted to be able to ask it now. Will there be more qualified sustainability reports and qualified audit reports, and what will be the implications?
okay, there are two auditors in the room.
There's only auditors like talking about qualifications. So.
Well, do you want me?
You can tell me, yeah.
Well, I would think yes. The answer is yes. Look, so it's limited assurance. So just so everyone remember, we're all living in the world of reasonable assurance. Limited assurance is a lighter level. But I think, quite frankly, there will be occasions when people, like right now, people voluntarily get limited assurance. It isn't voluntary, so therefore you're going to have to do something. But there is a period, as with the get out of jail card of 3 years, you can say, actually, I don't have it. Hands up, I don't have it. So I think we may have to open our minds to, we probably have occasions when we just don't have sufficient information. I'm hoping those 3 years will make it very minimal, but I do think there will be occasions when people just won't have enough in order to be satisfied. And I think we probably have to own that as a business community and realise it's not the end of the world. It's a very broad agenda. And guess what? The CSRD looks beyond every other standard that's in place. So you got to own up to the reality that you're kind of at the A grade. So I think there will be, but God willing, it'll be very little because we'll take our 3 years to get it right.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. And as I said, when I made the joke about others not liking to talk about qualifications, it's very much there's a cultural aspect to that. And I think the changes that this is bringing to how we report and how we assess and move from limited to reasonable assurance will probably change all of our frame of minds for working our way through and applying professional judgment, applying professional skepticism, but also bringing some balance to looking at this. And I'd certainly like to think that auditors will take a reasonable view when you see that companies on a best effort basis trying to implement these very challenging requirements.
Yeah, I think there'll be an interesting aspect, I suppose, even from things like the financial community who are, normally alarm bells go off and there's a qualified audit report. I think there's going to have to be a change in mindset a little bit, especially in the early years.
But you have to remember it's end-to-end value chain, so it's likely that something's not perfect in the system.
Somewhere in the system.
Yeah,
that's true. Sorry, there was a couple more, was there?
There is, yeah. Next one is a question for Aidan. We hear of US investors demanding that profit take centre stage. Are Irish or European investors willing to sacrifice profit for sustainability?
Yeah, like I said, there is some debate on that point, but I think you can demonstrate that investors in the European market are willing to take a 5% basis point, particularly on a bullish day. It stands to reason. It's basically economic supply and demand. There's more demand if you're a green prospect. There's the same amount of supply. You can drive better pricing outcomes. There is some in the investor community who don't like that. They don't want to say credit is credit, and the ESG aspect doesn't affect the credit. Therefore, it should be the same price. But if your book, when you're putting a bond out there, it's 3 times oversubscribed for green versus 1.5, 2 times oversubscribed for conventional, it just stands to reason you can drive better pricing outcomes. So yes, investors might not be overly willing to do it, but because of the demand that's there, it's happening.
I might add to that. I do think the premise of the question, I think, is a bit simplistic. I think it is more complex than that. One thing I would point to, and there is certainly a cohort of investors in the US that would look at, if you want to be very hard nosed about it, there's a correlation between a company that's well run, doing the right thing in terms of its community and the climate, and also being very, very solid in terms of its financials. And investors are wise to that, and I think that would include the US investor community.
Okay. I'm not excluding the room, but there was one more, I think, from Slido, was there?
The next one is, are the traditional audit firms the best providers for assurance on sustainability?
Marketing plug at the ready?
We asked Stephen.
The answer, of course, yes.
Of course, yes.
I think the teams have to change. I know I have a very different team than I would have expected to have.
Yeah, like I think obviously, when you think about, when an audit team puts together, we're well used to putting together specialists and experts to support an audit opinion, and this will be no different to auditing a complex IT area, a complex cyber threat. Granted, it'll be broader skill sets, new skill sets required to the team, but in terms of methodologies that firms are developed and are developing, they will be grounded in methodologies that are tried and trusted from an external financial statement audit perspective, as Stephen had said in his piece around financial reporting and how mature they are. The audit methodologies are obviously very, very mature equally. We are just going to apply those same methodologies, that same framework, that same thought process, professional judgment to a different set of standards. With challenge, certainly, but I think, as I said, it'd be difficult for one of us to say auditors aren't best placed.
No, well, I think with the reality as well, I totally agree with you. The other piece is, like our clients are standing up teams of engineers, environmental scientists, accountants, etc. So we're doing the mirror image because that's how we'll service you. As an audit isn't my first home, but do you know what I mean? But it is that exactly what we're doing because we have to. So it's a mirror image. It's equally challenging, but absolutely, you say, Patrick, we have the framework and the structures already. Like we all do assurance already. It's not a new task, and we do sustainability assurance on a voluntary basis. So look, I think there's room out for everyone in the market, but who's best, God alone knows, really. But we're ready.
To maybe give an outside perspective on that, I do think investors take comfort knowing that a proper auditing firm is providing limited assurance when it comes to reporting on green investments. So I do best placed in terms of their own process and setups. I can't comment on, but in terms of providing investor comfort, certainly, yeah.
And for those who aren't aware, there is a member state option around other independent insurance service providers, and we believe there will be a few countries around the EU who will bring this in. So we won't be at the bleeding edge here. We'll definitely get an opportunity to see how that plays out. I mean, if I can give a personal perspective on that, I've been talking to some of the IAASA and also IAASA, so the assurance standards providers, but also the ethical standards providers. And what they've said is the same standards will apply whether you're in audit or you're not in audit. And I think for those people in audit, you're used to that. You're used to the high level of around non-audit services and independence and all those sorts of things, which you've grappled with over the last sort of decade or so, but you have in place. I suspect for some of these independent assurance service providers, for them, it's going to be very difficult for them to separate the sort of consultancy and process implementation piece and then go, oh, yeah, but we're now independent and we'll give you an opinion. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in other countries. I just want to open up to the floor as well in case there's any questions from in here in the room for any members of our panel and anything we've discussed.
Kevin, you asked a question to a room full of accountants, is audit committee important? And obviously the answer is going to be yes. But the question really begs is, risk assessment is the key part of what audit committee is going to do. So would you think an accountant in an audit committee is essential for someone to identify risk? Because that's what we do day in, day out.
Well, I'll throw in the regulatory question, which is yes, because there is a requirement under law for somebody to have audit and accounting expertise, or at least one person to have that on the committee. But maybe I might throw it open to other people from a more sort of operational and practical point of view. Is the expertise an accountant brings, is that an integral part to an audit committee doing its work? If anybody wants to jump in there.
Yeah, like I'm happy to comment on that. I think the answer is absolutely. And you know, I did mention the ODC guidance that, you know, when I spoke to people from a non-financial background, so I talked about that group as being, you know, the exception, and it's obviously important for an audit committee members from a holistic perspective to draw upon different skills and organisation perspectives. But you know, it's grounded in, if you look at the core responsibilities of an audit committee, it is grounded in internal audit, external audit, risk assessment, compliance. And you know, the roles and responsibilities that somebody's coming from, you know, an audit accountancy background and having the literacy to be able to understand and assess and challenge. I think you do need to have, absolutely by law, but also by you know, by just common sense, need to have that level of expertise at the table. I think increasingly, as IT environments become more and more complex, people will need to ask themselves the question around whether actually do I need to have financial audit plus IT audit experience. That may be the next wave when we think about AI, and that may be future into the future proofing. But certainly, I think, you know, financial IT audit expertise is going to increasingly become more and more important to face the risks and challenges that organisations are grappling with.
Yeah, and perhaps even sustainability expertise might come in there as well. We're out of time, unfortunately, so I'm afraid we're going to have to draw this session to a close. So before I hand on to the next one, I hope you'll all join me in giving a round of applause to our panel. Thank you.